and other electronic devices, and refrain from texting during the show. Photography, videography, and other recording devices are strictly prohibited. Emergency exits are located at the sides and rear of the theater. Thank you and enjoy the performance.
I didn't realize this was going to be a performance. I don't have anything prepared to sing or to dance. But welcome to the next installment of the Presidential Speaker Series, in conjunction and partnership with the Center for Faith and the Common Good. The goal of these conversations is to introduce our community into a variety of topics that demonstrate civil discourse, but also give a window into what's happening in the world, and to do so through the eyes of those who are living it and are leading it. And so the next installment tonight, you're in for a huge treat, is with Jon Clifton. Jon is the CEO of Gallup, the polling organization, and I had a chance to get to know Jon a little bit at a conference in the Bahamas. And yes, I work hard for you in this role. But I spent some time talking with Jon and said, have you ever been to Pepperdine? He hadn't been to Pepperdine. I said, can you come to Pepperdine? And so this is in November, and here we are. But I'm not going to introduce Jon appropriately. I'm going to have Byron Johnson do that. And Byron Johnson has been working with Jon on a variety of polls and a variety of studies. As you know, as you've heard him on a prior presidential speaker series, Byron is the executive director of our Center for Faith and the Common Good, and is one of the leading scholars on the impact of faith on individual human flourishing and on society. And so please join me in welcoming Byron Johnson, who's going to introduce Jon Clifton.
Thanks, Jim. It's always good to be on campus, and to be on campus as a Pepperdine professor. It's really my pleasure to have a chance to introduce Jon Clifton, and I've had the pleasure of working with Jon for about 23 years at the Gallup organization, and Jon's father, Jim Clifton, was CEO for many years, and it has just been such a treat to plan surveys over the years and conduct surveys that are important surveys on religion and civil society, and it's actually something that started with George Gallup Jr. Some of you may remember George Gallup Jr. He was the one that introduced me to the Cliftons. And so it's just a pleasure to be able to introduce Jon. You're going to love him. You're in for a real treat. He knows his stuff, and his first book is a New York Times bestseller, and that's what you're going to hear about tonight. So Jon went to the University of Nebraska. He did his law degree at the University of Michigan, and he's been the CEO now for about a year at the Gallup organization. So we've collaborated a lot, and we're going to be collaborating a lot in the future, and so I hope this wasn't the last time that we're going to have him on campus. So please join me in welcoming Jon Clifton.
Thank you, Byron. Thank you, Jim, for those really kind words. It's great to be here. I also wanted to say thank you to the entire Pepperdine community, because we've hired a few alumni at Gallup from Pepperdine, but just recently we got our newest CFO, Tech Lee, and he got his MBA right here from Pepperdine, so thank you. And he's seriously one of my best friends at work. He's absolutely amazing. I actually just got off the phone with him this morning. He said, is there anything special I should know about Pepperdine? He paused, he got real quiet, and he goes, it's the most beautiful place on earth. He wasn't wrong, so well done, Tech. So thank you again for having me. I wanted to share with you a project that we're doing at Gallup, because we wanted to tell this story to the world, and it's two things. Number one, we tried to build the world's official statistics for how people feel. And the other thing is that in building the world's official statistics for how people feel, we found a trend that has us very concerned. And so we came out with this book because we want the whole world to know about it, and so that's why I'm here tonight, is to tell you about it. So the first thing is why do we care about how people feel? You know, there are a lot of these I don't know if you call them Friedmanites or shareholder capitalists that say, especially in workplaces, that what we care about is profit, not necessarily how people feel. So why does it matter? And the reason is it has to do with two things. And the first thing I want to talk about is whether you call it behavioral economics, whether you call it the rise of effectivism, how we feel determines how we act. In fact, one of my favorite quotes comes from Yuval Noah Harari, but he says that we are ruled by our emotions. I often joke with people that if you're one of those people that think, well, that's others, it's not me. No, then you probably are acting more on your emotions than the rest of us. So at Gallup, we actually tried to quantify to say how much of our decision-making actually is emotional. And what we found using brain scans and using buying behavior in customer interactions, we wanted to know how many of the times do we make decisions based on things like price, and how many times do we make decisions based on how we feel. We find that it looks like this. 70% is based on our emotions. 30% is based on how we feel. I'll give you an example of this, because if you ever run an organization, I promise you, this is going to be one of the most important things that you keep in mind, is it's how your customers feel. And I say that because we did a little research thing with a bakery in Washington, D.C. And one of their biggest customers, she spent a couple $100s with them every single month. Now, for a bakery on a street corner, that's a lot of money per month. But one day she left and she never came back. So you look at their ingredients, nothing changed. Everything rational. The weight in the line, the price, nothing changed. Except one thing. Somebody disrespected her. And she vowed to never go to that place again. But if you think of her rational buying behaviors, the price of what she was buying, the ingredients that went into it, nothing changed. If she was an automaton, a robot, her buying behaviors wouldn't have changed based on being treated with disrespect. But because how we feel often dictates how we act, she vowed to never go back again. That's the 70-30. That's behavioral economics. That's effectivism. Now, I say that because, again, if you're one of those individuals, you can see that I'm fresh off of reading a lot of Yuval Noah Harari's work. But he says that even Nobel laureates in economics make only a tiny fraction of their decisions using pen, paper, and calculator. 99% of our decisions, including the most important life choices concerning spouses, careers, and habitats, are made by the highly refined algorithms we call sensations, emotions, and desires. Now, you might be thinking, well, let me see an example of that. Okay. So now that Gallup has been asking people all over the world, how do you feel? We have trends dating back almost 20 years. I want to show you two of them. The first one has to do with what I would consider as one of the most significant events over the past 2 decades globally, and it's the Arab uprising. Now, when you hear of the Arab uprising, although it started in Tunisia with a gentleman in Sidi Bouzid who self-immolated, and what he screamed was, "I just want to work." His name was Mohammed Bouazizi, and that's why it was originally called the Jasmine Revolution. But oftentimes when we think of the Arab uprisings, we think of the imagery of Tahrir Square, where about 1 million people went into Cairo to protest about President Hosni Mubarak, which eventually toppled him. But if you look back at traditional economic indicators, which play to our rational mind, what did GDP per capita tell us in the lead up to the Arab uprising? This is actually what it was. GDP was growing in almost a perfect linear fashion. In fact, if you look at the Human Development Index, which is made up of 3 things, number 1, income, life expectancy, and also educational attainment. If you take that exact trend of the Human Development Index, it too showed perfect progress over the past 5 years in Egypt. In fact, if you look at the HDI and GDP for Egypt, Tunisia, and Bahrain, it all grew in perfect linear progress. So from a rational context, things seemed okay. But how did we feel? How did people in Egypt feel? How did people in Tunisia feel? Well, based on surveys, in a nationally representative way, this is how they felt. We found that 28% of people were thriving in 2006. That put Egypt on par with the global average. But then it collapsed down to 9% in 2011, which puts Egypt on par with the Palestinian territories. Tunisia followed exactly the same trajectory, dropping from 24% all the way down to 11%. And one of the single largest two-year drops that we've ever seen in the history of our database was Bahrain, where 44% of people were thriving, and that too dropped down to what looked like the Palestinian territories. So based on all of the rational indicators, everything seemed okay. But based on how people felt, things looked a lot different. Here's another one of the, what I would consider one of the biggest events of the past 20 years. If you don't agree with me, I guess the New York Times said that morning, the UK shocks the world. In fact, it was so shocking that Prime Minister Cameron resigned that following morning because he bet his career that Britons would vote to remain, I guess is what they would have said. And you know, honestly, when you look at all traditional economic indicators, I don't really blame them. Because if you look in the quarter leading up to the actual Brexit vote that took place in June of that particular year, the economy was growing at 2%. Unemployment dropped below 5% for the first time since the 2008 global economic crisis. Everything from a jobs and a money perspective seemed okay. But how did people feel? This is what our data would suggest in terms of how people felt. That 15-point drop is one of the largest two-year drops that we've ever seen in the history of our database. If that would have been a 15-point rise in unemployment, it would have been headlines everywhere. But if it's a 15-point drop in how people feel, it goes almost totally unnoticed by leaders, but it doesn't go unnoticed by the people. These data were actually analyzed by an academic by the name of George Ward. He's at MIT now. He did this research when he was at London School of Economics. But what he believes, these are his words, not mine. I don't actually fully agree with it. But he says that based on life evaluation data, he can predict the outcome of elections. Do you remember that whole debate? Was that 1970 when Reagan and Carter were on stage? And Reagan made his closing argument and he said, ask yourself, is your life better now than it was 4 years ago? What George Ward believes is that not only, well, was that potentially a pivotal moment in that election and also a famous quote now in politics, but he believes that it's actually true, that people do vote based on how their lives are going, which is kind of funny because if you take James Carville's famous quote about it's the economy, stupid, you could actually just change it to it's how your life is going, stupid. So, again, this is why it's so powerful that when we're looking at emotions, it's not only important to understand how they are, but also to appreciate the very fact that it's how human beings make decisions. It hugely influences how we vote, what we buy, but also whether or not we take to the streets. So I just want to quickly review how do we measure this, because these are cool trends, but what is Gallup actually doing in this process? And I want to share this with you only because maybe it's selfish because I'm fascinated with it. And I also quoted what I believe is the greatest play of all time, which is Rent. And in that song, Seasons of Love, they ask a great question. How do you measure the life of a woman or a man? And by the way, if you need a reminder, text or look up the lyrics because they have some great questions. Is it midnights or cups of coffee? We did not take that path to measure a life of a woman or a man, but instead we took a bit different of a path. So we started off by saying if we're going to understand how people's lives are going, we need to go virtually everywhere. And so to date, the green countries are where we've been. The gray countries are where we have not been. So you'll notice North Korea is highlighted. That's because the very idea of Gallup interviewers going door to door asking how people's lives are going is not something that Kim Jong-un has been thrilled about. But I promise we would do it in a heartbeat if we would be allowed to. We also have American law. So as an American organization, we have to follow the Trading with the Enemies Act. And so if the United States puts sanctions on something, we have to follow those laws, and we will. That said, sometimes it can be very disappointing because we believe that it's even in the interest of the United States to understand how people feel across the entire world. Papua New Guinea is a different issue because we translate everything into every major language in every country. There are over 800 languages and dialects spoken in Papua New Guinea, so that has been difficult. We will get there. It's just a money issue. but we will one day get it so that people there have an opportunity to have their emotions be heard. This is actually what it looks like in 2/3 of the world. So we actually, if we're doing face-to-face interviewing, we have to figure out what house do we go to. So we use a process what's called a multi-stage stratified cluster sample. And to grossly oversimplify, forgive me if there are any survey research experts in this room, what we do is we take every country in the world and break them up into what look like U.S. congressional districts, meaning every physical territory has exactly the same amount of people within them. And then from there, we use a selection process by identifying various households. If people don't live in households, we identify a cooking pot, because again, if you don't live in a house, we still have to make sure that you fit within our sample. And then we go in and we actually use a sampling procedure that we use within houses, all the while to ensure that everybody in every country has an equal chance of being selected. This is what it actually looks like when it's taking place. This is a woman being interviewed in Indonesia. We have evolved. We used to use paper and pencil in many countries. Now we use handheld devices. These handheld devices are remarkable. They allow for GPS coordinates. We can actually capture audio if necessary. For survey research nerds like myself, it also allows for a lot easier skip patterns rather than flipping through annoying pages. They have no utility outside of this, by the way, so we have had them stolen, and then the person who robbed us has to go find out that they can't download anything other than surveys on it, and trust me, that's not that awesome. And so this is also what it looks like. So sometimes, yes, we do have, that was pre-COVID, which means rather than time, it's actually, that was me 25 pounds lighter. But we actually go out into the field because we want to get qualitative research. And we actually want to understand behind the questions that we're asking why people say the things that they say. So one of the things, and by the way, this woman's answers were never included in our final database. This is simply for testing purposes, because to having a white dude from the United States sitting in a home with her might actually change her responses. But one of the questions we ask everywhere, and now this metric is actually a part of the Sustainable Development Goals indicators that the UN puts out, which is, in the city area where you live, do you feel safe walking alone at night? And she said no. Now, from a leadership perspective, when you hear that somebody doesn't feel safe, instinctively, you think one thing. What are they afraid of? Crime. So at the very end, and again, if we would have started working on crime, we wouldn't have fixed her problem. So money, resources, hours, anything we would have put it in, we wouldn't have solved her issue. So at the very end, the woman sitting next to me asked a very wise question. She said, when you said no to that, what were you afraid of? And she said, rabid dogs. But a safer world for her is not necessarily crime. It's to get the rabid dog issue to go away outside of her community. But that's the importance to continue listening, because so many times when we ask a question, we hear an answer and we think, I can stop because I already know what the problem is. You don't. So this is really valuable source for us as we continue. So this is actually what it looks like, and here are the questions that we ask. So there's two ways to understand how somebody's life is going. The first is through objective indicators, which are great. How much money did they make? How many times have people been arrested in a community? Also, whether or not do people have jobs? What is the rate of literacy in a particular community? All those are critical to understand how someone's life is going. But on the other side of the ledger is what we call subjective well-being, which sometimes is shorthand we call happiness. And if I'm doing real talk, we call it happiness, because if you say subjective well-being, most people fall asleep faster than we want them to. But for some reason, if you use the word happiness, people click on it. In fact, I actually tested it with an article I wrote. I switched out subjective well-being with happiness, and it increased by about 5x in terms of how many people read it. So the words that you use are critical, even though sometimes it may not feel like the perfect descriptor in terms of what it is that you're using. So we break it down into two things, because the human brain, basically the way that their well-being is experienced is two things. I'm trying not to use the word experience here. But the first is what you call the self-narrative. Your brain is hardwired to think of the story of you. In fact, what's very interesting about this is that no matter how much we think that we truly remember the story of ourselves, we don't. There's a lot of it that we add in, even with TV shows that we watch. We edit our own history. but the story of you is a process of your brain remembering what all life events that you went through. We're trying to capture that on one side of the ledger, because one of the ways that our brain works is this aspect of the story. The other one is how you experience life. Now, in a dream world, we've done this before, it's a gross assignment, but we followed people around and we told them to spit in a jar. Trust me, it's gross. And what we were doing is we wanted to understand their cortisol levels. How much stress do they have? Now, interestingly enough, people do oftentimes, they're in touch with how much stress that they have. But ideally, we would have some sort of button that we could understand their emotions or get a brain scan. But from a cost perspective, it's prohibitive. Imagine literally having people in brain scans in 150 countries. You can't do it. But if there was a way, that's what we'd do. But in order for us to do this now, we ask them, how much stress do you have? How much anger do you have? How much physical pain do you have? And how much joy do you have? And so that's the other side of the ledger, and those are the two things that we look at and track throughout the entire world. So those are the questions that we ask, and the questions that I just showed you from the UK and from Egypt, we're asking people to rate their life on a scale of 0 to 10. And last thing, if you're ever in a discussion about this, do you guys know who the happiest countries in the world are? Somebody said Finland, they're 100% right. And so that is produced by the World Happiness Report. If they bury us in the fine print, I don't know why they do that. It drives us nuts. Anyway, that is actually that question. So we ask people, rate your life on a scale of 0 to 10. 10 is the best possible life, 0 is the worst. Where do you stand today? And so the countries that rate their lives the best are crowned the happiest country in the world. And the countries that rate their lives the worst, they're just listed at the bottom. And so interestingly enough, it's probably not happiness. And in fact, in the 2012 report, they actually admitted it's not happiness, as I mentioned. It's more of a measure of contentment. And that's why when they do man-on-the-street interviews and ask people, Finland's the happiest country in the world. What is it that you do? And they go, no, we're not. In fact, they asked a minister, and they said, Mr. Minister, the results just came out. How do you feel? And he goes, if we're the happiest country in the world, I would hate to see the other countries. And so again, it's because what they're measuring is not actually this fleeting, ephemeral, momentary joy. What they're measuring it's actually us, is contentment. Those are the most content countries in the world. In fact, the countries that experience the most joy, when you say who laughs and smiles a lot the most, it's Latin American countries. But Latin American countries also experience the second most negative emotions in the world. So it is my wife is Latina and from El Salvador, so it's also one that's very expressive, and we see that very clearly in our data. Okay, so this is where I want to share with you what I think is one of the most concerning things that so now that we've worked on producing the world's official statistics for emotions, what do we see? Because the world is addicted to things like GDP per capita. I mean, the amount of leaders talk about GDP growth or unemployment, for example, is out of control. Approval ratings is another one. George Gallup was actually the one that originally created that. So just like George Gallup created that staple in political discourse, we wanted to do that for the world's official statistics for emotions. This is what we found. So when we started doing this, we found that it was kind of flat. But over the past 10 years, we saw a very concerning trend because we've seen a 10-point increase in the amount of extreme anger, stress, sadness, physical pain, and worry. And by the way, most of the times when people consume this information, they immediately look to their own lives or their own communities in order to explain the narrative or what they see on social media. But remember, the United States only makes up 330 million people out of a world of 8 billion. So looking at this trend, we also have to remember that 1/7 of the database is China and 1/7 of the database is India. So what is it collectively that the entire world is experiencing now that's causing this increase? And if there's one thing that I would look toward, it would be this. And it's what we call well-being inequality. It is very different from income inequality, which is the haves and have-nots of money. This is the haves and have-nots of a great life. We looked at the top quintile for people, the 20% of people who rate their lives the highest. And we found over the past 15 years, they went from an 8.3 to an 8.9. So the people who say they have great lives, that 20% of the world, is saying their lives are even better than they were 15 years ago. And if you look at the people who have it the worst, the 20% who rate their lives the lowest in the world, this is what it looks like. 20% of the world almost can't say that their lives are any worse. On average, they say that their lives are a 1.2. That widening gap of well-being and inequality is serious, and it's that group at the bottom, their negative emotions are going up dramatically. Now, the next question is, what causes that? Because here on this data chart, if you want to know what causes somebody to rate their lives well, they have 5 things in common. And for the people who rate their lives the worst, they have those same 5 things in common, except they're largely missing from life. And so what makes a great life? And when I focus on each of these 5, I just want to explain the bottom quintile. And it was inspired by Nobel laureate Danny Kahneman, who helped us build much of this research. And it's interesting because so many people talk about positive psychology. He calls himself a negative psychologist. But he says, we speak of happiness. The dimension is labeled by its positive pole. And that's very unfortunate because actually increasing happiness and reducing misery are very different things. I would not focus on the positive end. I would focus on the negative end. And I would say it is a responsibility of society to try to reduce misery, which is basically that 1.2. So here are the 5 things that we see contribute to a great life. If all of these things are present, it is very hard not to be thriving in life. And if all of these are absent, it's really hard not to be suffering in life. So here's what we found. The first one is social well-being. This is just the relationships that you have with your family and friends. But what if you don't have any relationships with anyone at all? Before the pandemic, we asked, over the past 2 weeks, how many people did you spend meaningful time with? We had people say back to us 150. We had some say back to us 70. We had others say 20. But then there were the people who said no one. In fact, one time we called a gentleman in Canada. We went through the whole survey, and at the very end, we asked his age. And he paused for a second, and he said, it's funny you asked that, because today is my birthday, and you're the only person I've heard from all day. This is a Gallup interviewer that just randomly called him. In the absence of that, he would have heard from no one on his birthday. How many people live just like him? 330 million. Exactly the same size as the United States. But it's not just a loneliness problem. It's also a quality of friend problem or a quality of relationship problem with your loved ones. We asked another question, which is, if things got really bad and you needed somebody to help you out, do you have anyone? 20% said no. 20% of all adults said no, they don't have anyone to help them out in a time of need. Think about that. So that's one of the single biggest causes. There's an academic, Julianne Luntz-Holt at BYU. She said in her research that experiencing debilitating loneliness is the same thing in terms of your health as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. She says that it basically increases your chances of dying of anything by 50%. It's that bad. The next one is financial well-being. Now, this one's funny because I swear it's for thousands of years we're trying to determine, does money buy happiness? And it's like the more research we do on it, the further away we get from it in terms of an answer. But where we are right now is what we find is that money does not buy happiness. But it is really hard to be happy without it. And so what we find is that 2 billion people are so uncomfortable and in such a state of despair with their own income because they don't have their basic needs met that it's wreaking havoc on their well-being. And again, up until 2019, interestingly enough, this was getting worse. Think about that. And the percentage of people who said that they couldn't get by on their daily needs was getting far worse. Now, interestingly enough, some of that adjusted a little bit during the pandemic and improved slightly. But ever since then, we've seen it going down a little bit. The third one is your physical well-being. One of the reasons, so again, the WHO says that to have great physical well-being, it's really 2 things. It's what you eat and how much physical activity that you have. Now, the challenge, though, is with one of the biggest problems the world faces today is that right now, 60% of humanity lives in countries where the single biggest physical health crisis is obesity. And so the very challenge with that is that although for the past 40 years we've been winning the war against hunger, we started to lose in 2014. And the FAO has been blaring their warning signs, et cetera, for a long time about this. But those that are experiencing debilitating hunger has been on the rise significantly over that period of time. And again, I've joked with a few here that you don't really need a white paper to prove this, but you can see that there is a strong connection between anger, stress, sadness, pain, and worry when you're experiencing debilitating hunger. And that's making a huge contribution to the rise. The last two is, one is community. Living in a great community is a huge plus to your overall well-being. But today there are 2 billion people around the planet that live in communities that they wouldn't suggest for a friend to live in because they're absolutely broken. And there are two things that make a great community. One, you have to have the basics. If you have broken infrastructure, if you don't have things like education, healthcare, et cetera, it's really hard to thrive in your community. But what makes a great community is not infrastructure. What makes a great community are people who give back. And there are bright spots in this because we find that there are over 1 billion people that even when they have very low income, they figure out ways to give back. They give back not just with money that they have, they also give back with their time, and they help total strangers. In fact, many years we found that Myanmar was one of the countries where one of the highest percentages of people gave back. And if you want to know one place that actually has a very strong community sense of well-being, I would argue that this is one of the most generous countries in the world. And I say this not just because the rest of the world says negative things about this country a lot for a lot of reasons. And they say, well, gee, that country's rich. Of course they can give a lot of money. But not only does this country give one of the highest percentages in terms of the percent of people who give money, they're also one of the highest percentages who give their time to organizations and who help total strangers. You know what country it is? The United States. This is one of the most generous countries in the world. And if you look at our data for a place like China, it's not very generous. So one of the things about America is that America has strong communities. The last one, and again, I often tell people maybe this is a bit kind of a more quotidian, I guess, aspect of life, but it's our work. We will spend 110,000 hours of our lives working. On the lower bound, you'll spend 83,000. The only thing you'll do more is sleep. If you're miserable at work, I promise you, your life will be awful. And the other thing is not only is your life going to be awful, we've done the research, you make your loved ones miserable too. And the very idea that if you're one of those advocates that says, oh, we need to have a work-life balance, just because your boss can't email you after 5, I promise, you can't compartmentalize like you think you can. If you're miserable at work, that misery will follow you home, despite the fact that you don't have to think about work after 5. And that's a problem. And on that note, I want to talk about solutions, because I think there are ways to be really, to me, I think this is really the other global warming. You have people at the United Nations that are collectively talking about some of the world's biggest problems, things like the war in Ukraine, even though a lot of them weren't talking about the war in Ethiopia. I can't really figure that one out. Things like inflation, but none of them are talking about the very fact that collectively people feel a lot more miserable than they did 10 years ago. And I think it's really concerning because, again, as I mentioned before, it's based on how people act. And the last one is this. If you don't think that it's causing total chaos globally, then let me ask you this question. From 2011 to 2019, what happened with global unrest? Because the Global Peace Institute quantifies it. Global unrest increased from 2011 to 2019, 244%. Now, maybe I have my cause and effect wrong, and maybe the global unrest makes us more miserable, but I would go so far as to say that actually misery causes us to take to the streets. And my concern is that's what we see globally. Now, that said, I think there are ways that we can make a better life for a lot of people. And I'm just going to give you one example. Maybe then you can read the books to understand the other 4. How is that for a shameless plug? I mean, they're already bought outside, so I just Books are really hard to write, so um, this is the one I want to focus on, which is work. And if you look at the emotional state of today's workplace, in the United States, I'm going to show you the U.S., I'm going to show you the world. It looks like this. If you want to know the percent of people that are thriving at work in America, it's 32%. Now, that middle group, what I'll call quietly quit, they're not engaged, is 50, and the people who are truly miserable are 18%. The emotional state of those 50% and 18% are really bad. That's a really awful state of mind. They come to work every day, and they don't really know what they're supposed to do. They don't have the things they need to get their job done, and they usually have a really awful relationship with their manager and their colleagues, which they blame the fact that they can't go back into the office on the commute, and it's really because they hate their colleagues. But anyway, that's a separate issue. And so if you think the U.S. is bad, look at the world. Because here's the percentage of people that thrive at work globally. It's only 20%, which means 80% are either kind of miserable or totally miserable, and that's a problem. Now, if you think to yourself, well, gee, John, what does this have to do with the global rise of negative emotions? I want to show you how much of negative emotions are explained by your relationship to your job. And it looks like this. Well, first, let me show you how it's quantified. This is how we capture engagement, and this is how we capture well-being at work. And the reason I call it well-being at work is because Danny Kahneman was being interviewed by Adam Grant. And Adam Grant had a great question for Danny Kahneman, but he said, Danny, he said, do you think we've gone too hard on measuring engagement at work and we should look at overall well-being? And for those of you that know Danny Kahneman, this is so how he would answer, but he lets out this loud gasp and he goes, well, I think this is more your area, but he said, I don't think it is the role of the company to focus on your overall well-being. But what I do know is that it is the focus of the organization to care about your well-being at work. And he went on to say, I think Gallup actually measures that because they ask questions like, do you have a best friend at work? Or they ask questions like, do you have the opportunity to do what you do best? Or do you feel like you have an attachment to the mission and purpose of the organization? And so these are the questions that we ask because a lot of times executives in companies, when they're trying to fix somebody's well-being at work, what they do is they bring somebody in to say, let's get everybody to do a whole bunch of yoga. And they invest in a whole bunch of yoga mats. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with yoga, because I'm sure there are some aspects of yoga that I think are quite incredible. But here's the problem. Which of these 12 items do you think is the single greatest contributor to stress at work? And for those of you that are experiencing a lot of stress at work, I'm just going to crystal ball this, and I guarantee I know what the problem is. The single biggest contributor is number 2. I have the materials and equipment I need to do my work right. We went into a manufacturing organization and said, do you have the things? And they all laughed, and they said, no. Now, when an executive hears that, they think of a company that buys a bunch of Segways so that they can get out to the volleyball courts or something like that. That's not what employees are saying. Those folks that worked in that manufacturing environment, they said, the thing we need are gloves that fit. That's not a money problem. That's a listening problem. You're already spending the money on the gloves. Just get them that fit. So as soon as they see yoga mats roll out, they're now worse off because they saw that not only were they not heard, they just saw an investment in something that's not fixing their problem. These are the 12 elements that we know actually make you feel better at work and that actually have a lasting impact, not just throughout your work life, but through your overall life. And if I can't convince you in terms of actually caring about your colleagues, I can convince you as a shareholder capitalist on why this is important. But before I do that, here's why you should care from a humanitarian perspective. This is your negative emotions. I feel like I'm doing one of those drug things. Here's your negative emotions on thriving at work. When you thrive at work, and by the way, one of the greatest lies ever told about work is when people say, find a job you love and you'll never work a day again in your life. I think it's called an enthymeme. Somebody in here will know what that is. But there's a false assumption in there because the very definition of work is the exertion of some sort of mental or physical activity in order to accomplish something. Think about that. If you climb Mount Kilimanjaro, I promise you will have stressful moments. And a lot of people do that intellectually in their jobs or physically in their jobs. You will have days of stress. You will have days of worry. You may even have days of pain when you're trying to accomplish something, certainly if you're trying to change the world. So you will not have a total absence of negative emotions. But if you have a great job, negative emotions cannot be the soul of that job. And you can see it just slowly shift, where if you're not engaged, there's a slight increase in negative emotions, but here's the worst state, which is if you're actively disengaged, if you've loudly quit, you've taken to TikTok, and you say you've quietly quit, which is actually quite odd because you're not being quiet about it at all. But if you're miserable at work, you have exactly the same amount of negative emotions, if not slightly more, than those who have no work whatsoever. And this is not a U.S. trend, that is global. That's based on a sample. I rolled 3 years of almost 500,000 respondents in roughly 160 countries. So again, if right now, if you say, I'm a stakeholder capitalist, great, check, I'm done, that's all I needed to know. I can convince you on the shareholder side too, or if you're a customer capitalist for that example. But if you work on that aspect of worker well-being, you see higher customer loyalty, higher productivity, you see higher profitability, and you also see less absenteeism, less turnover, less shrinkage, less safety incidents, all the things that you want as an executive in an organization. And by the way, if you don't think that relationships matter at work, I promise I can beat anyone in that argument. There's some people, they just don't believe you should have friends at work. I don't know, I can't convince them. There was another study done, it was across 40 countries, and they said the single thing you can do to keep someone in a job, it was the same, if not slightly higher than pay as a predictor. Make sure they have a friend at work. But again, for those that just can't stand it, I can literally use like a machine gun of data, and I still can't defeat their belief that you should not have any friends at work. But those that manage and actually create a thriving environment, here's what it looks like. So here's today. Here's what it looks like around the world. We found that there are 57 organizations that are so well run. They have over 70% of people who are thriving at work. They cut the negative emotions every single day of their colleagues in half. But imagine if every single organization in the world was run just like that. It would literally overnight correct this emotional global warming that we're experiencing. Anyway, those are my comments. I hope I didn't go too long. Thank you for listening to me for a little while as well.
Wow. Thank you, Jon. What an overload of information that is so useful and helpful to...
Was that a compliment?
No, it is. I mean, I've read the book.
It was.
I will fish for a compliment, though. If you're looking for the book in print, then we have them here for you. If you're looking for the book on Audible, where you can listen to it, it's now available. But Jon, let me ask you a quick question.
This is true.
When we met in November in the Bahamas, was your book available on Audible?
It was not.
And it has been made available on Audible since.
That's true.
What was the causation for that?
It was. This is a true story. It was you.
I said, dude, I don't think I got time to read your book. I really want to read your book, but I have to listen to your book. He said, well, we've been talking about putting it on Audible. I said, there's a lot of us that, just can't sit and read a book because we're in a car a lot or we're walking a lot. And so a couple months later, it was on Audible. So I've listened to it twice.
I will say now, business philosophy has all of a sudden become very interesting to the world now that 200 CEOs have now announced that they are stakeholder capitalists. This has Milton Friedman turning in his grave right now. Shareholder capitalist can't say. I'm actually not either one. I'm a customer capitalist. And so that was my an example of me actually listening. So, yeah.
Excellent. Well, let me ask you a question about slide 17. And slide 17 was the chart with all 5 well-being measures. And we at Pepperdine would say, I think you're missing one. I think you're missing a connection to a community of faith or a belief in a higher power. Let me ask you, Have you studied that? Are you planning on studying that? Is that wrapped into the other ones? If so, kind of what's your reaction to one of the best measures of well-being is really a submission to a higher power?
That's a great question. If there are a lot of things in our research that I think rightly so you could critique, and maybe we do have some imperfections, and that could be one. And the domain that we wrestle with the most is work well-being, because at one point we called it purpose well-being. And the challenge is just understanding about how and where people manifest their purpose. And the other thing is, when it comes to faith and it comes to religion, what is religion? What is faith? And I say that because there are a lot of good, smart people, and they even, study the brain, and they say there are some people who reserve that part of their brain to worship a religion of capitalism, to worship a religion of socialism, communism, to worship, some argue, wokeism. There are many different, I think there was even a study that said the same part of the brain that lights up for religion is the same one that lights up for sports affiliations with teams. That you have these diehard fans, I don't know, the Yankees or whatever it is, but I think what's true is that humanity wants to be a part of something. And we asked a question to the entire world where we said, do you believe that your life has purpose? And it was so overwhelmingly yes, in every single country in the world, that we quit asking it, because it was basically like saying, do you breathe air? Everyone feels they have a purpose, but understanding whether or not like they feel like they've realized it, or maybe they are realizing it and don't even know it. So I think that is a place that we need to better understand. Now, specifically on religiosity, and again, it's not for me to sit here and determine what is a religion and what is not a religion. But when we think about traditional notions of religion, things like Christianity, Islam, etc., there's almost a paradox that emerges when you study it. And Angus Deaton did a fantastic paper on this. And actually, I think it was one of the papers that was cited for when he won his Nobel. But what we find is that there are countries where people, in terms of their well-being, they're thriving. But those countries have a negative relationship with religion. The less religion that they have, the more likely that they are to be thriving. But then when you look within country, you actually see that the more religious happen to be more likely to be thriving. And the same is true when you look at individuals throughout the respondent, so you don't control for country or that kind of thing, and you also find that they tend to have slightly higher well-being than the non-religious. So it's almost like a paradox that exists, and it's very hard to make sense of it all, because you do see some of these richer countries, like European countries, where a lot of the traditional ways of religion have declined. Whereas you see some of these poorer countries, Latin America and Africa, where religion is thriving, but they are in poorer circumstances. But then again, you unpack it within country, and you see that sometimes people with religion tend to have higher well-being than their peers within that same country. So it's one that we're grappling with. I can't say that we fully understand it, but what we are doing is working with Byron on a massive project to better understand causality. Because again, if you want to poke holes into all the research Gallup has done across 150 or 160 countries, I assure you can poke a number of holes in a lot of what we do. And we're open to that because we always want to constantly make our research better. But the best way to do this is through panel research, is to follow the same people over time. And it's not as easy as you think. Those exist here in America. They don't exist in El Salvador. They don't exist in, pick any country that you want, in Ghana. And so we're trying to build them. And the problem is they're just expensive and it's hard. And so this famous book that came out called A Good Life, by this Harvard study where they followed around, a bunch of Harvard students and, some other individuals in the Boston community. They followed them for 80 years. Not a lot of those exist around the world. And we're trying to change that. The barrier is money.
So Jon, just for a second, if you can, tell people how you created the Gallup World Poll, and then we'll transition back to what you were just talking about, this project that Gallup and we are doing together on global flourishing. But just so people understand the heavy lift that it was to create the world poll, nothing like this ever existed before.
So there were two inspirations for this. One was what we ask and why do we do it. The first one is what we ask. George Gallup is really famous because of politics. In fact, the presidential approval rating is something that George Gallup created. And now it's a staple in any political dialogue. But in the 1950s, Edward R. Murrow was asking him a question. I was joking with these two earlier about this, that he literally smoked a cigarette throughout the interview. That's how dated it is. And so through a plume of smoke, he says to George Gallup, of all the things that you've studied, what interests you the most? And George Gallup says to him, well, I'd have to say happiness. But it's a big moment for those of us at Gallup that, love our founder, think that what he was doing was way ahead of his time. And so it inspired us to say, let's put booster rockets on what it is that interested him the most. And the second one is a story that was right after 9/11, America declared war on Afghanistan. And there's this really interesting moment where somebody in the press looked at Donald Rumsfeld. This is when polls said Donald Rumsfeld was very popular. Somebody in the press said, Mr. Secretary, how is America viewed in Afghanistan? Are we viewed as liberators or aggressors? And Donald Rumsfeld kind of shot back in a hostile way, and he said, how would I have any idea what they think in Afghanistan? Do you think I can get a Gallup poll taken there? Well, our CEO at the time was watching it live, and he thought to himself, well, maybe we should go do a poll there. And we'd been doing surveys for a long time. It was actually very difficult for us to get in there at that particular time. We're in Afghanistan every year now. We did 9 predominantly Islamic countries, found amazing things like, the Bush administration was saying they hate us for our freedom. We didn't know who they was. I was in college at the time. We didn't know what to make of what happened. Anyway, what we found is that people in predominantly Islamic countries in open-ended ways, we said, what is it you respect and admire about America? And the first thing they said back was their freedom, other than their technology. So the messaging may have not been right in terms of building, global harmony. But anyway, at that moment, somebody said, well, why do we just do these surveys in the U.S. and predominantly, why don't we do this for the world? And so it was at that moment where we said, and let's also do what our founder wanted, and we said, let's create the world poll. Now, the other thing that you're asking, so that was kind of the history behind it.
And it cost, I think, $150 million.
Yes. A lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and money. And so, our previous CFO, not the Pepperdine CFO, said it cost, this was about 8 years ago, it was over $100 million. Every time you see somebody doing interviews, we're paying them. Not the people being interviewed, but the people that are walking across the planet. They need paid, and we have to negotiate, prices for gas and that kind of thing. And it's really expensive. And Gallup has been paying for this since it started. So if we could do it more frequently, and if we could do it in a way that we've now been experimenting because of the Templeton Foundation.
Yeah, so this project that we're collaborating on, we are literally following the same people over time, about 250,000 people, which is truly unprecedented. It's never happened before. So like the World Poll was a game changer, so is this Global Flourishing Study, to be able to track this many people. And it's a nightmare, but it's also, there's every week there's a new problem to troubleshoot,
Yeah.
But it's something that we think will change the world.
Amen.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the dip we saw in the global well-being or the thriving. And it seemed to be, as you said, for the first several years, maybe 2005 to 2013-ish, it seemed to be pretty steady. You felt like, okay, we're validating our data, it's consistent, we're doing a good job, and then it dropped. And so a lot of us in here were here when Jonathan Haidt was here, when he was talking about kind of the state of psychological well-being in this country and it dropping about that time. And he talked a lot about the impact of social media. And so I want you to, if you could just kind of unpack, what did you find with respect to the impact of social media on this thriving, both here in the U.S. and worldwide, and what did you find in places where there wasn't social media?
I think a lot of times people see that trend of the widening well-being inequality and they go, I got the answer, it's social media. Because, what social media did was simultaneously put all of us in each other's homes all at once. I mean, so if you're a poor Salvadorian girl and you now get onto TikTok, ByteDance has allowed you to now see into the home of a Chinese billionaire. And that actually happened, right? So there was a Chinese billionaire, and they could see that, I think it was his daughter or something, she was posting, and they had a gold toilet. And there are a lot of people that are really struggling, and when they see that, they're like, I'm sorry, what? And so the question is, how much of the global rise of unhappiness is being caused by absolute, what I'll call absolute misery or comparative misery? And the reason I say that is because is your life in absolute terms the same? And now you have a window into what a great life looks like, and you think life is worse precisely because of what you can see. Well, the only challenge with that very easy narrative is this. 1/3 of the world is still not online, and their misery is going up dramatically. That is a knockout punch in terms of saying that this is not actually being caused by social media. It's actually being caused in absolute terms by misery rising because of things like hunger, loneliness, and spending just a life of misery at work. And so I think the question is still out there, that it very well could be compounded by social media, but I do think that there is a non-social media aspect that's causing this.
Let me ask a follow-up on that, and it may be that the data doesn't bear this out, but you talked about how if your work well-being is low and you come home, it's going to be contagious to those around you. You're going to take it out on your family, on your friends, and it's going to affect, your community. Is misery contagious in the sense that, let's say you're not online, but people in your community are, and those people in the community are miserable because of social media, or they're dropping, and as a result, my misery is contagious and causing you to be less happy as well because I'm miserable. Is there an argument there, or is it countries that they're just not online and it's happening there as well?
Well, we know for a fact that misery and negative emotions are indeed contagious, and that network effects are real, right? So, the studies that Nicholas Christophas have done with respect to people smiling, that people, even on Facebook, who are smiling in their pictures are significantly more likely to be connected to other people who are smiling. And people who are not smiling are significantly more likely to be connected to people who are not smiling. But the network effects are so absolutely incredible that if you become friends with someone who is friends with someone that smokes, you just increased your chances of being a smoker by 8%. The same is true with smoking, obesity, laughter, but the same is true as also with negative emotions. So yes, network effects are so profound with humanity that those things can spread. Now the question is that linked to a misery from social media? It also makes it assume that everybody's becoming miserable because of social media, and I don't necessarily think that's the case. I do think that if you told me put a number on it, I think that it's actually about 20% who spiral because of social media. I think there's another 20% who actually get an emotional boost from it, and I think there's a 60% that it's maybe a net negative, or just kind of a net neutral. Because remember, social media and all our connectedness has had very positive effects. For example, many of our grandmas follow us on social media, and let's be real, you were not calling grandma before that, and you definitely weren't calling her before the pandemic, which also could explain one of the reasons why in some surveys an older population actually saw an increase in life evaluation during the pandemic. Why did that happen? So again, I think there's some aspects of social media. We can't just lay blame and say that they've been totally awful. But I do think that there are some hugely negative effects that we can't ignore.
I think maybe we're getting close to our time limit, aren't we,
Yeah,
Jim?
we've got
we have some
about
time.
another 5 or 7 minutes, and then
Good.
we're going to open up these
Good.
microphones to the audience.
Well, one of the things I wanted to say to our audience is that this current project that we've launched together with Gallup on human flourishing, we will be looking at the faith factor. And so we've assembled a stellar group of scholars, over 50 scholars, that will be working on this project. And we will be looking, as Jon said, religion's complicated. And so because our N size is so large, for the first time ever, we're going to be able to not do a deep dive just on Christianity like most of the research in the West, but we'll be able to look at Islam and Hinduism and other religions, Judaism, because we'll have sufficient insights to do that. And religion is it's an important topic. It should be treated well. And we're going to be able to do that. And we will be able to see how much religion is or isn't responsible for flourishing, and for people who maybe are not flourishing, what role religion plays. So that's one of the things that we're most excited about with this Global Flourishing Study.
So let me ask one more question, and then as you're thinking of your questions, just kind of make your way down to either side of the aisle. And remember, Jon is the speaker and the expert here, so we'd love to hear your questions rather than your expertise advice. So just be thinking about your questions you have. But let me look at the title of the book as those are coming down to ask questions. Blind Spot: The Global Rise of Unhappiness and How Leaders Missed It. So that's the subtitle is The Global Rise of Unhappiness and How Leaders Missed It. Let me ask you what you would say the subtext is, which is the answer to, and what we can do about it, or what we should do about it. Because it's one thing to say, and you've talked about some of that, but distill it. What would you say? Yeah, here's the problem, here's the solution. So can distill that for us.
I think this is a place, and I get into this about where the private sector and the public sector each have their own particular roles. But take global loneliness, for example. I mean, I think a lot of people kind of mock what took place in the UK and Japan when they opened ministries of loneliness. But I think the best part of it is it was a group of people that came together and said, let's do something about it. Japan became famous for their suicides. So famous that it surprises a lot of people to hear the fact that they have dramatically brought down suicides over the past 20 years. I mean, you only hear from the negative that it was so bad that the fact that they've improved it dramatically hasn't even caught up to the fact that they've lived with this. Now, let's also be clear about the fact that the government has now created better social networks, and one of the other places that they've tried to fix but they haven't is the workplace. I mean, the workplace in Japan is famous for being one of the most dysfunctional workplaces in the world, and we have quantified it every single year. Now, a lot of people will even blame it on like East Asian societies. It's not true. If you look at China, China's figuring it out. China had one of the most miserable workplaces over the past 20 years. And if you say back to me, well, surely the 996 culture still exists. I read about it all the time. And there was the woman who posted about the fact that she was so beaten up about work that I think she actually died. Remember, that's a sample of one. And when we look at the workplaces, there is a focus, and it's actually increasing and improving, where now 19% of people throughout China are now thriving at work, surprisingly, at least for this American. So there are ways to improve this. Another place that's getting a lot better at this, where they're, again, famous, horrible workplace, was Singapore. Singapore's getting it turned around. So again, I think when the public sector actually starts focusing on these things, that they actually get it right. And in the private sector, again, I think this really comes down to leadership and management. I think a lot of times people just have a great underappreciation, and they actually don't say, what is the emotional pulse of the workplace? And they don't ask themselves, do we have an Arab uprising that's going to take place in our workplace? And oftentimes that Arab uprising manifests itself in unionization. And you can track that kind of frustration and misery just by engaging in conversations at scale with your employees. Talk to them, listen to them. And if you do, and everybody agrees on things, people can thrive, they can be more productive, and it can benefit stakeholder, shareholder, purpose, or customer capitalists.
Excellent, thanks. Those have come down. Anybody coming down? There we go. Start us off.
Hello. Thank you for speaking today, by the way. I appreciate it. I've enjoyed
Thanks for having me.
So my question is, how does Gallup generate revenue so that you can survey people all the way around the world?
I was wondering that same thing.
It's a great question, yeah. I explained how much of it goes out the door. How does it actually come in? So we do three things. Number one, we help the world build the world's official statistics where they don't currently exist. So like, for example, we work with a company called Hologic. They're a company that builds medical devices for women's physical health. And they said, listen, we're a purpose-based company, and we not only want to help get medical equipment to women all over the world, we also want to help understand if we are actually better serving women in their physical health. So they don't have any data on things like what % of women have been tested for STDs in every single country in the world. What % of women have had a mammogram in every single country? Those data don't exist. They may in the rich world, they don't in the poor world. So they hire us and we build it for them.
Okay,
and then two other things, but go ahead.
I was just going to say, essentially, you are able just to provide data to companies that can impact the world in a better way.
That's right. Or to the public sector. So like the United Nations will hire us to. We do projects on hunger, on financial inclusion, that kind of thing. Okay. The other two ways that we make money is we do strategic consulting for companies. It's usually grounded in behavioral-based insights. And the second one is we created a product that was very successful for us that's called Clifton StrengthsFinder. At one point, StrengthsFinder 2.0 became the best-selling book on Amazon, even more than those, I can't remember what those, 50 Shades of Grey and Harry Potter.
Never heard of them.
Seriously, StrengthsFinder was a better seller than those at one point. And so, but we've really had a group of individuals that said they're sort of champions for the cause of getting people in touch with what makes them great, and they find that Clifton Strengths, which was actually created by my grandfather, Jon Clifton, is a way to help people realize their potential. So it's exploded. He had a dream that 1 million people would take Clifton Strengths. I think people laughed at him, and this year we crossed 30 million. So we have a new shared goal that 1 billion will do it.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Jon, thank you so much for being here. I feel really grateful to hear this insight. My name's Haley. I'm actually a doctoral student here at Pepperdine, and I'm looking to study actually well-being in the workplace, but more specifically looking at the remote hybrid workplace, global. So I'm wondering what areas of opportunity you see specifically in the remote workplace for further research.
That's such a good question. Okay, sometimes you can't quite find all of the most important sort of insights just by asking people what they want. And I think this is why the rise of effectivism is so important, is because sometimes people don't necessarily make decisions that are good for them. And I say that because our rational minds can justify the fact that we don't need to go into the office ever again. And I'm talking about people who are remote ready, because there's a separate issue that I think is emerging that's going to get worse. Because right now you can see that people who are remote working are a lot of times the boss, and then they're making people go into the office, but they stay at home or work completely remote from Florida, and I think it's driving people completely nuts. But rationally, you can sit there and say, look, the one thing that I hate most about going to the office is the commute. 40% of people say that that's the single thing that holds them back from wanting to go, and it's a very understandable thing. And the other thing is that working from home actually has massive benefits. There are time use studies that actually show that if you do not drive to work, you will spend more time with your family and friends, you will spend more time eating out, more time working out, fertility rates increase, you have less sick days in terms of work. It's like everything works out well except for one thing. You start to emotionally detach from work, and your work well-being suffers from it. You have less relationships at work. There are, especially women, especially people of color, there are studies that show that they have less development opportunities when they're working either hybrid or fully remote. So I think this is where leadership is so critical, because, George Gallup once was asked something about, do you think politicians should just vote the polls? And he said, no, I don't. He said, I think they should always do what's right, but they should at least know what people are thinking. Most all people want the flexibility in terms of being able to work from home. But I do think that there needs to be some kind of agreement that says we need to get to know each other as people and build relationships that we can't build on Zoom.
Excellent, thank you. We'll go here one more time and then over here. So thank you for introducing yourself. Would you do the same, just a quick name and your place at Pepperdine?
Hello, my name is Jalen Hill. I'm a political science major here at Pepperdine. I'm a student, first year. So I have yet to enter into the working force, which is what I wanted to ask you about. Since you said that so many of us suffer from not liking our job or just like not liking our workplace in general, and that causing us to be generally more unhappy, do you have any pointers that maybe you could give me or us on how to decrease the chances of us being unhappy at the workplace or increase our chances of thriving?
That's a great question. The question has to do with what does increase your chances of thriving. And it's when you do a job that plays to your strengths. I think it's that simple. And we at Gallup are obsessed with strengths, so much so that they're on our emails. I put it at the front of my slide, what my top 5 strengths are. But I think when Mihai Csikszentmihalyi talked about what flow is, flow has to do with when you get into a problem that you're trying to solve, a goal that you're trying to achieve. Flow is when you're doing something that's very engaging to you. So if you have learner in your top 5 and you're consuming new information, you're gaining energy. If you have communication in your top 5 and you're speaking to an audience, you're gaining energy. You can do more and more and more of it. If you have competition in your top 5 and you get challenged, it's almost like time slows down. You know when they talk, I'm not a baseball player, I don't really like baseball, sorry. I know everybody's saying they're getting tired of, sports analogies in the world. Well, I don't really like them either, but I'm going to use one. But when they say that a great baseball player, that when they're batting, that when the ball comes at them at like 110 miles per hour, that the ball actually slows down and they can see the laces spinning as it approaches them on the plate. That's what it means to be using your strengths in what you do. And so I think if there's anything that if somebody wants to have success in life, is to get in touch with your strengths so that you can have that moment where the ball slows down and you can see the laces.
Excellent.
One more question.
Thank you. Well, we're going to go to the next one, so come over here since we got a line of folks.
We can chat afterward if you have another question.
Hi, John. I'm Caden. Thank you so much for your talk today. I really enjoyed it. My question was about, I think on your graphs, those drops in unhappiness were around 2015 or so. I was just curious, what specifically caused the dramatic drop in workplace thriving during that time? Was it something kind of going on in corporate leadership or?
I'm sorry, were you talking about the Egypt, UK graphs?
Yeah, those graphs, yes.
Okay,
sir.
so those graphs were what we call are the percent of people that are thriving. So we asked 2 questions, rate your life on a scale of 0 to 10. Then the second one is rate your life where you think you'll be in the next 5 years. If the respondent says that their life is a 7 or better today and an 8 or higher in the next 5 years, we consider them to be thriving. Those are not arbitrary cut points. Those cut points actually tie to everything else. It means that you have a house over your head. It means you have the right kind of income. It means that you're engaged in your job. It means that all things are kind of working in life. So you asked about the decline, and I'm going to give you an answer that is frustrating for me, but I think should be energizing to many. I can't quite put my finger on why. So I go through in blind spot as an analysis as to why did the decline take place in the UK? There are other data sets that actually corroborate the decline that we saw, some that actually tie to these concepts of those that are being left behind by globalization. So even though that they have economically benefited from being in the EU and are even told that leaving the EU will not only reduce GDP by 10%, but that you will also see a decline in your own economic circumstances. That argument was so not compelling to those individuals. I mean, literally, Cameron bet his job on it, where he said right before the vote, if you vote for Brexit, his quote, it would be like putting a bomb underneath our economy. And Britons go, that's fine. and so again, this sort of economic interest was not compelling to them rationally, but the very feeling of being left behind by whatever it is that's going on by EU integration may have caused a frustration at large. There may have been other factors that would have taken place. Another one, and I put this in there that I very well could be wrong in this, which is politics makes us miserable. Like this idea that when you have a dialogue at Thanksgiving about politics, everyone feels worse because you brought it up. And I'm that guy because I talk about politics because I find it so fascinating. So we did a study, and this is so interesting from a psychology perspective, so we're interviewing Americans every single day, and we say, who are you going to vote for, Obama or McCain? This is in the 2008 election. So people tell us, right underneath that question, we say, now rate your life. Election's over, and we remove the election questions, and then we say, how's your life? And the numbers spiked. And we're like, that's amazing. That must have been just all about Obama's election. Now, some of that is true, but we stared at it long enough, and our chief scientist, Angus Deaton, went, well-being didn't go up in America. We're like, what do you mean? They said, that's what's called a context effect. The presence of the political questions made people feel worse, so they answered those questions worse. Isn't that amazing? So when we have a highly contentious election, is it actually making us feel worse about our lives, and we're therefore just feel worse? That very well could have been the case with Brexit, and we've seen some evidence of it even with the U.S. election. So I don't fully know. I think there are some convincing answers. And again, the other one, there was a survey done by, I can't quite think of his name right now. I'll get it in a second. But when we asked them, do you think it's better for the economy to leave? They said, no, I think it's worse. A majority of Britons said, I think it's worse for the economy to leave the UK. So the message worked. But they said, what about for your life? And a majority said it'll be better for my life.
Thank you.
So we've got 10 minutes left, and we've got 5 people in line, so we'll freeze those and do 2 minutes per. And here we go.
Hello. I was just wondering whether you considered the environment as one of the factors towards well-being, because it's shown that immersing yourself in nature can be really alleviating for anxiety and depressions, and like creating green designs and workspaces can also improve productivity. And so I was just wondering your thoughts on that.
If I had a blind spot in this book, my own, just to use the title against myself, it would have been that.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is because so it's really hard for us in the data to make connections about global warming, for example, because there isn't really a question to ask about whether or not somebody is suffering from global warming. How do you know? Because interestingly enough, there are kind of 2 ways, right? One is, have you been the victim of some kind of natural disaster, but then proving whether or not the natural disaster would or would not have occurred based on global warming is very hard to determine. That's the first one. And the second one is that if you ask people about their feelings about global warming, the closer to the equator that you get, the worse they think it is. Think about that. Or if you check the temperature of the day, the hotter it is, the worse they think global warming is. So there are a lot of emotional aspects that make it difficult, but we can do this, which is we did an analysis where we looked at life evaluation patterns, I think it was, and looked at the temperature of the day and where some areas had been because of global warming, and we could see that there is a connection. And I think one of our modern philosophers is Ambassador Andy Young, and I was lucky enough to hear him speak at an event we had, and he made a comment very similar to what you said, which is, we do not fully understand humanity's relationship to the environment. And we very well could have emotional changes that we can't fully explain yet. And so, yeah, I think there very well could be something that's having to do with that.
Thank you. Next over here.
Hi, John. Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. I'm here from Career Services. My name is Usman Khan from the Graduate School of Education Psychology Career Services team. I'm a huge admirer of Gallup and strengths-based leadership, and I'm curious, you talked about specifically you conceptualized the 2 states of being in terms of objective and subjective states of being in terms of subjective happiness. And I'm wondering, why hasn't this been the status quo and the norm ever since before? Why is there so much of a focus, as you referenced in your talk, on GDP and unemployment and such, and why why isn't the focus on state of being and well-being and happiness? Why is that a missing piece?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
You talked about there's a big focus on unemployment and GDP and how nationally, globally, we think of these measurements for how there's a focus on those aspects. But why isn't there a focus on looking in state of being, looking at the indexes of well-being and happiness and these
Why are
constructs?
leaders not paying attention?
Yeah, why are those?
I think there are
why
a
is that
few
missing
reasons.
piece?
Okay, I think there are a few reasons. I think one of them is that they don't think that this is a measure of value. I think they think how you feel is something that you need to, is a you problem, not a collective humanity or a leadership problem. Number two, I think there are a lot that think it is soft stuff that can't be captured. I think this is especially true within organizations. I think there are CEOs that hate doing things like engagement surveys because they say, why do I care? They get a paycheck. Why don't they basically shut up and get back to work? And the reality is that it's not all about money in that particular context. Money matters, for sure. But, there are basic human needs. I mean, heck, if you go back to Maslow, he's been trashed for, some reasons, whatnot. But if you look at it on the whole, that was pretty darn good work that he did. I mean, but in a workplace context, if you think, we basically tried to build Maslow's hierarchy of needs at work. And so one of the things that human beings need is to be recognized for good work. Another thing is they need to know what to do. I talked to 60 or 70 CHROs, and they go, we already do this stuff. Well, why are you telling us this? And I said, if you're doing it so well, why is it not working? Because literally half of humanity that has a full-time job can't strongly agree that they know what they're supposed to do every single day. Like, forget if you don't think that making someone want to go totally nuts is not an issue to you, what about do it for human productivity? If you look in the richest 40 countries of the world and you look at GDP growth, it is coming to a screeching halt. It has been in decline for 20 straight years. If you want to change productivity, why don't you just tell people what they need to do at the office every single day? It's madness, yet people still do it.
All right, excellent. 3 more questions. 1, 2, 3.
Brad Combest, second-year grad student at the School of Public Policy. I actually had a question that kind of builds off of the previous one. And as it relates to GDP, why do you think governments are so inclined to embrace statistics like that? There's a book called Seeing Like a State, which suggests that their governments try to make the world legible, and they can't handle complexity. And the well-being, to me, seems like it's a very complex sort of measurement. Do you think it's something like that where they can't handle the complexity of statistics like well-being or the measurement of it? And if so, how do you think you go about getting leaders or governments entirely to embrace this type of measurement?
I think there is a fallacy in our own logic that we believe that we are rational agents or creatures and that therefore others are too. And we just haven't fully embraced the fact that Brene Brown said it best. She said, we think we are rational actors that sometimes act emotionally, but instead we are emotional creatures that sometimes act rationally. And I think that flawed logic goes all the way up to world leaders because they think all you need to do is make sure people's rational needs are met. Make sure that their incomes are right, that the economy is growing, and that they have jobs. And again, unemployment, don't get me started on that. They just want to make sure that, everybody has at least 1 hour of work per week so that they're not considered unemployed and that all of a sudden we'll be okay. I think that's the problem. And until humanity starts to have a deeper appreciation, this has been the challenge in economics. We think that in econ, that everybody's a rational actor. It's not true. And I think until we get that sorted out, I don't think there'll be a switch to understand the power of human emotion.
Great, thank you. Next question.
Hi, how are you doing, John?
Hi.
My name is Alex Zakarian. I work in admissions at the Graduate School of Education and Psychology, and I'm also an MS student at Pepperdine. I want to know if you work alongside the government with any projects, and in particular the U.S. government?
Yes. Yes. We work with governments all over the world. So we're currently doing a project with the European Union, trying to actually help assist them by capturing data so that they can look at well-being all the way down to the community level. They don't have congressional districts. Every country has their own thing. You know, like Switzerland has cantons, America has states, some have territories, and they're all over the place, right? Like in India, Uttar Pradesh that state has got more people in it than most countries have people. I think, 250 million people? So you're trying to get down to what's called the NUTS 1 and the NUTS 2 levels to understand human well-being and couple it with that. So we also do projects with the U.S. government. In fact, our founder, George Gallup, was doing projects with the government. Apparently, he was doing surveys in Nazi Germany behind enemy lines to understand what people were thinking, what they were feeling, to better inform the government. We do some market research surveys for Voice of America to understand if people are listening to it. We do projects, again, I'm just talking about some of the public ones. One time we asked about trust in government statistics. Trust is collapsing in every institution in the world, and it's happening everywhere. And we also do projects where we try to build stronger cultures. The United States Postal Service has been very open about that. Gallup does the Voice of the Employee survey. So of the 600,000 people that work at the United States Postal Service, we go in and try to help their voices be heard at the Postmaster General level. And the last thing is we help people get in touch with their strengths and do coaching around it. And we're really proud about that, and we do it for any government. If it was legal, I promise you this, we'd do it for North Korea, because I think, honest to God, I mean this, I think everybody has a right to thrive at work, and I think everybody on this planet has a right to be able to be in touch with their strengths, and I don't care what government it is.
Okay, as the last question is coming forward, let me just make a quick announcement. When we're done, after this last question is answered, John is going to go up the side and to the back and sign books as you leave. So don't grab him here so he can get back there and make sure people get their books signed. So last question, and then we'll wrap up.
Hi, my name's Gia De Silva. I'm a second-year political science major at Pepperdine. And I was just wondering, you spoke a lot about the well-being of the workplace, but you didn't really speak about the well-being of, for a lot of college students, their college is their workplace, and especially here at Pepperdine, where you have to live on campus for the first 2 years, you're living in your workplace. And I was just wondering if you guys do any research on how that aspect of, social, but also education, but also for many students, their work life as well. Some students work on campus, and some people just count their education as their, work-life balance, especially in these undergraduate years. And I was just wondering if you guys do any research based off the well-being of students and whether they're on campus, off campus, or just their workplace in general.
No on the off-campus, on-campus one. Yes, we do a lot of research in higher education, specifically on well-being. We do find that those 5 drivers are incredibly important, and I agree with you, not a work context, but in a higher ed context. It's also true, by the way, in high schools. We started doing a project in high schools where we looked at the hope and engagement of students, because one of the reasons that people drop out can be their well-being at home. One of the reasons people drop out is because they don't have hope for the future. And those are really powerful indicators. So we've been working with a lot of high schools on those particular indicators as well. And the last thing that we're trying to do is there are a lot of campuses that are trying to become strengths campuses. It's like the University of Tennessee is a strengths campus. Every single one of their freshmen goes through strengths. They have the opportunity to get coached. They even make keychains of their top 5 strengths, so they can always have their strengths in mind. What we want to do is we want to build content so that if somebody feels like they're not thriving in one of those 5 aspects of well-being, that they can figure out how to thrive using one of their strengths. And so if you have learner in your top 5, how does learner help you drive your physical well-being? So we're working on building that content right now so that we could make it available to campuses in the next 12 months.
Thank you.
Fantastic, great question. Let's join me in thanking our guests. You're dismissed.